Well, hello, this is Apostle Tommy Quick, and I'm excited. We're beginning today to start our series of virtual workshops, an opportunity for you from your own home, in the comfort of your home, to gain tremendous information and knowledge that will help you to be successful in building a strong family, one that lasts, and not only that, but strong generational heritages. One thing that we've witnessed is a breakdown of the generations in our time. You know, it's been reported that elderly people suffer more in our time than in previous times because they, in many cases, don't have the support of their children and grandchildren in their latter years. Well, you know, we must turn that trend around. We must get back to solid families, solid foundations that endure, that allow us to bring forth successful children, morally successful, spiritually strong, that love God, that know the value of family, and that will keep with the virtues that make the family strong. That's what these 30 workshops are going to be about. Now, what you're going to realize is that we're going to be addressing many of the challenges that are coming at the family today, and we're going to show how many families, unfortunately, are not prepared to meet those challenges. They come with us from entertainment, from education, from science, you name it, from so many different ways. But the prepared parents and those who build along the lines of the Word of God, that use God's Word and doctrine as the foundation for forming and functioning in family, are yet successful in our land, even in the midst of the cultural shifts that we're experiencing today. I have brought together people that I believe are qualified through profession and personal experience to talk to you and to talk to us about these challenges and how we can best, deal with them, how we can meet them and overcome them, and assure that our marriages stay strong, that our homes are founded on a solid rock of Christ, and that our children will be nurtured in Christ, and that they will keep the faith as they leave the nest to go to establish their own homes. That in spite of the messaging that is coming at them from all areas of our society that want to belittle the family, belittle chastity, belittle righteousness, that wants to be amoral or non-moral, or to make people think that there is no God, we are still enabled by God to build strong, lasting families that will nurture generations, and that when Jesus comes back, we'll all be caught up together to meet him in the air. Well, Apostle Tommy Quick here again, and I'm just growing more and more excited as we proceed throughout the day. And our next guest, listen, I'm so excited to have with us Dr. Derryck Green. Now, the reason I'm excited about Dr. Derryck Green, because he is a phenomenal individual, and he is doing a tremendous work, and he's an influencer across the country. He is a member and speaker for the National Advisory Council of the Project 21 National Leadership Network of Black Conservatives, and is a regular contributor to its sponsor, the National Center for Public Policy Research. His research includes economic policy, culture, race, abortion, religion, and immigration. He is a writer and a blogger whose work has appeared in and has also been cited, not only appeared, but been cited by newspapers and online media across the country. His work has been featured and cited in a number of media outlets, including Town Hall, the American Spectator, the BBC, the NBC, the Daily Caller, the American Conservative, the CQ Researcher, and many newspapers across the U.S. He is a faculty member of Prager University, and his course, Who Are the Racist Conservatives or Liberals, has over 1 million unique views across several social media platforms. Dr. Green has earned his Master's of Art in Theological Studies from Fuller Theological University or Seminary, and is doctorate in Theology and Spiritual Leadership with a concentration in identity formation from Azusa-specific university. It is my pleasure to welcome this distinguished man of God to our program today, and he's going to talk to us, and what he's talking about is right at the heart of CFADD. When destructive decisions are no longer considered destructive. You know, there's been a shift in our society, and in many cases, the unacceptable behavior has become acceptable. As an example, incarceration. We think incarceration is a trap. Many think that incarceration, which was one time something to be avoided and rejected, in some communities is now expected and accepted. There's a rising trend in incarceration numbers for black males and females over the past 3 decades. The trend is so high that it can only be described as a pattern of mass incarceration. According to the recent data, blacks are incarcerated 5 times more than whites, making up nearly half of the prison population. Additionally, black youth have the highest rate of involvement in the juvenile justice system. A return to the traditional family is a fundamental part in reversing this devastating trend. Today, we welcome Dr. Derryck Green, and he's going to share with us concerning what we should know about the trend of incarceration and how the black family is the answer when it is structured and functioning according to biblical principles. Thank you so very much, Dr. Green, for being with us today.
All right. Well, thank you, Apostle Quick, for the introduction and the invitation to be here with you today. I think that I hope this provides a lot of benefit for viewers and listeners because as I travel around and have, at least over the last year, haven't been able to travel, but still speaking to churches and church-based organizations, I'm finding out that a lot of these issues in which I'm going to discuss are discussed in the local churches. And I think that one of the ways for us to correct some of the things that are hampering our communities is to start from the church level, the strategies and things of that nature, and then branch out into the local communities to bring more people in to, in essence, refamiliarize our communities with the moral foundations that are predicated in the Bible, using that foundation to correct some of the things that are going wrong in our communities. And I am a firm believer that no one can change what's going wrong in our communities except for us. And I hope to make that clear in my remarks. So again, thank you for the invitation and allow me to share my ideas with you. And I hope that they bless people not only today but in the future. Now, to begin, in my opinion, the post-civil rights period has been defined by black identity politics. Now, being black in America has obligated us to stress the dependence on or proximity to racial victimization. Now, this victimization is preserved by many things, but mostly the lack of socioeconomic parity or equity with white Americans. The conviction and habitual exploitation of racial grievance gained traction in the period immediately following the Civil Rights Movement. What followed the moral revolution for justice was a more combative and performative movement that emphasized black race pride and identity, pursued social and economic access that presupposed and many times required outcome-based equality, and demanded financial reimbursements for past sufferings. Now, the consequence of collectively defining ourselves as racial victims is that blacks continue to suffer from what I would call a racial insecurity and emotional crisis in the new world of multiracial and multi-ethnic integration and freedom. Repeatedly redefining what it means to be black in America as a service to self-esteem stems from racial anxiety, unresolved feelings of inadequacy, and unrealized aspirations associated with our history of degradation, which understandably contributed to racial self-doubt. Now, demanding to be treated separately and with special circumstances based on historical degradation, rather than judged by universal measures of character and merit-based achievement, is the opposite of what Reverend Martin Luther King had dreamed. Now, racial uncertainty and anguish, which is partially the result of belonging to a cultural group that has been traditionally treated as less than human, then second class and unequal, has significantly compromised individual self determination, self worth, and earned achievement. In essence, we're struggling through an identity crisis. And I think to a degree, it's defined as being almost singularly dependent upon Black identity and associated characteristics, such as cultural traits, ideological preferences and demands, political support and behavior, and the historical association with Black oppression and subsequent grievances, all of which precipitates entitlement. Now, it's further defined by the insistence that people, groups, and institutions, or society in general, treat Blacks with a certain racial privilege, granting us special dispensations as compensation for historical discrimination. Now, when examined, these dispensations have been generally consistent with lower standards and expectancies. But increasingly, what I'm seeing is that these indulgences are distinguished by having no standards and no expectancies with respect to Black ability. Now, this is a hard bigotry of no expectations, and it's self-destructively endorsed by us Blacks and validated by far too many whites, and is seen as more favorable than being judged by universal measures of character and the rigor of merit-based achievement. This mentality is almost an in-group reinstitution of separate and unequal. The desire for special treatment is in part the result of Blacks not having fully embraced and achieved the civil rights movement initiative to culturally integrate and fully assimilate into American society, achieving a sense of identity, belonging, and accomplishment in America on our own terms. We enjoy the advantages of being in America when it is convenient, but reject a wholesale commitment to the American experiment. Now, to do so when it is convenient, or to do so would mean surrendering that which we hold most dear. And it is, again, the post-civil rights era, it's been defined as a hyper-racialized identity of past persecution, which is used as leverage for social and economic allowances. We want the social and economic comfort and security of being in America without having to fulfill the requirements of integration that the civil rights movement began. Now, this isn't to say that there still aren't obstacles that we must overcome. It is taking, it is with full knowledge, knowing that these obstacles are still there. Some of those obstacles are still there, but we have the ability to transcend them based on the power and strength of our legacy in this country. Now, unfortunately, straddling the fence preserves the feelings of racial angst, resentment, inferiority, and antagonism. Now, this part American, and in some essence, is perpetually angry and eternally oppressed community-wide attitude severely constrains Black development. It constrains our autonomy and our quality of life, and compromises racial and ethnic reconciliation both in the American church and in society at large. Additionally, this disposition frustrates the advancement and comprehensive realization of Black well-being. It handicaps the capacity for us as American Blacks to determine our own fate by requiring racial and ideological group conformity and fidelity above all else, including our identity in Jesus Christ. This racial assertiveness that sequesters Black agency is balanced by white passivity, restraint, guilt, submission, deference, and worst of all, coddling. And what I hope to do to make very clear with what remains of my remarks is that outcome-based equity and Black development are going to be forever at odds with one another, because outcome-based equity is somebody interceding on our behalf to either lower the standards or give us something or things that we did not earn, which by definition compromises our ability to develop ourselves to be competitive with our multi-ethnic counterparts. And I think that by severely constraining our ability to develop ourselves, we send the message that we constantly need people to help us. And I think that's a bad tack to take, because I think, again, considering our history in America and the things that we have already overcome in a country that was much more racist and against us in the past, we definitely have the ability, we definitely have the fortitude, the intestinal fortitude to meet these challenges and then transcend them. Now, as a result of the social and political transition from integration to separation, or from civil rights to black power, we lost the moral authority of race neutrality that defined the civil rights movement. Reverend King and the civil rights movement appealed to the unrelenting moral logic that emphasized Christian characters such as discipline, self restraint, obligation to societal decency, and mutual respect, and also love of neighbor, rather than emphasizing color or vengeance in pursuit of justice and equality. This strategy was successful in highlighting and defeating the moral hypocrisy and racial double standard of segregation, a clear violation of the American ideal. Christian nonviolence and restraint in the face of physical intimidation and violence demonstrated dignity and persistence in pursuit of actualized justice. These virtues compelled the nation to make good on its claims of democracy, freedom, liberty, extending to blacks the same legally protected God given rights that are articulated in the Declaration of Independence and subsequently enumerated in the United States Constitution. The new racial protocol of black power and black identity politics, however, reversed this equation. Radical black identity politics required that blacks be judged primarily on the color of our skin and the past nature of racial oppression. Despite the noble ambitions of race neutrality, integration, and being seen as prevailing over past limitations resulting from systemic injustices, depicting us chiefly as helpless victims in need of external intervention has become conventional. In the eyes of our multi-ethnic counterparts, we have been infantilized, and I find that personally offensive. Consequently, this has effectively obstructed honest discussion regarding the remnants of racial discrimination, the contributing factors of economic disadvantages, and to what extent we, either passively or directly, have contributed to our own disadvantage. Embracing a militant and confrontational black identity irrevocably connected to chronic racial victimization has been detrimental to black civic and cultural development. It has tarnished the heritage and reputation of black religion, black politics, and our families and our character, all in content and practice. Now, hear me out. I'm not going to get too political, but I want to tell the truth about what the data is suggesting. Now, when it comes to politics, it's the reason that one political party very intentionally takes blacks for granted while the other political party ignores us altogether. It's why both political parties create deliberate and sometimes incoherent strategies of Hispanic outreach characterized by racial pandering rather than courting them or us by addressing issues that restores or augments a common humanity and affirms a common national identity. The political pursuit of Hispanics continues despite us as blacks representing a greater percentage of the electorate. Now, in the 2008 and 2012 elections, blacks represented slightly more than 12% and 13% of the electorate, respectively. During the same election cycles, Hispanics represented 7 and 8%, respectively. Now, though black voter representation dropped significantly from the two previous presidential cycles, blacks were still a greater percentage of the electorate in 2016 at 12% than Hispanics that were at 9%. Now, the 2020 election was an outlier. The exit polls show that both blacks and Hispanics represented 13% of the electorate. And we'll have to kind of wait till some more polling comes out, and have to wait to the next presidential election cycle to see if that maintains. But nevertheless, the two major political parties are fully aware that overall we vote in greater numbers than Hispanics. However, both parties are also abundantly aware that largely we limit ourselves because we only focus on race, and race only goes so far and not as far as it used to. Therefore, neither party shows an urgency or a desire to address these human issues that are important to us as blacks. So traditional race language is constantly, it just recycles itself, but it doesn't create anything new of value. Now, ironically, black group solidarity and the lack of religious influence keeps blacks voting almost exclusively for the political party a political party that socially and politically reinforces this narrative of racial helplessness. It contributes to the diminishment of black cultural relevance and credibility, and it increasingly supports policies and social positions that clearly contradict and undermine traditional Christian beliefs, broadly speaking, but particularly in the African American tradition. Now, if we want to avoid becoming the social, religious, and political afterthought that many people think that we are, it's imperative that we move beyond the narrow confines of race. our identity shouldn't be so marginally defined. We should first re-embrace our Christian identity, rediscover our individuality, and then welcome full participation in the national experiment. Now, it begins by speaking more than the language of race. I believe the way to demonstrate full participation in society, the reacquisition of our credibility, and to demonstrate the ability to positively contribute to our own development that necessarily improves quality of life indicators in Black communities begins by rebuilding and redefining the most fundamental institution of society, and that is the family. That lends itself to prioritizing those things that contribute to personal and social development within this institution. Now, to do this, Blacks must learn to speak the language of education, specifically demanding increased access to superior teachers and superior schools via education reform. We should demand that school vouchers, access to charter schools, the freedom to choose schools not determined by zip code, and other reforms that reflect the ultimatum to change the substandard educational status quo that has for generations deliberately underserved Black school children. Allowing Black parents, particularly poor Black parents in areas that lack resources, to move to neighborhoods with better schools, the power to choose what schools their children attend empowers both parents and the child, but it also facilitates a self-determination and self-reliance. Educational reform that includes school choice provides parents multiple options to choose better alternatives of academic instruction and preparation for their children. This provision allows parents greater interest and involvement in their child's education. Now, it's not enough for us to mouth half-hearted platitudes about wanting higher quality education for our children. And it's even harder to do when we habitually and uncompromisingly support a political party that devotedly restricts our freedom of educational choice and refuses to deliver meaningful quality schooling to Black school children, particularly in the inner cities, resulting from the political demands and monetary contributions from teachers' unions. Now, again, we've seen over the last year, over COVID, when our children have had to engage in distance learning, what the teachers are doing based off of the unions. Now, people all the time, they don't understand that teachers unions is nothing more than a jobs program for teachers. Their priority is to employ teachers and to maintain that employment, to get them paid and to get them better benefits, which is fine, but that usually comes at the expense of school children. And as we've seen over the last year, in places like Los Angeles and New York and Chicago, that comes at the expense of our children. So they can't mouth that they want to improve the academic quality of Black school children and close the racial disparities between academic preparation, but then don't allow our children to go back or allow us the opportunity to choose what children and what schools educate our children. They can't have both at the same time. The intergenerational strategy of the education establishment has been to provide inferior education to Black children because teachers unions, again, as I said, are jobs programs for teachers. And they will continue this approach because we, as Black families, we allow it to happen until we don't. Moreover, Black families must also address the academic performance deficit by prioritizing academic achievement, but while firmly rejecting the idea that a culture that promotes and celebrates academic excellence is guilty of acting white or pursuing academic superiority is not authentically Black. We used to do this all the time, and there's a period of academic excellence in our communities, particularly when we were excluded from schools that whites went to. We simply said, okay, we're going to create platforms of education that are going to rival some of these white schools, and we did that in a number of areas in D.C. and in places in the South. So if we can do that in an America that was much more discriminatory against us during that time, we're able to do it now. And if we want to be taken seriously on our own terms, but also in comparison to others, we must reject the legitimization of mediocrity and failure that accompany affirmative action and other racial preference programs and diversity schemes. Besides being quota initiatives, these programs are a rationalized safety net that weakens our ability to compete with our multi-ethnic counterparts, as I said before. Moreover, preferences stigmatize Black achievement because it declares that our achievement is contingent upon lower standards. According to the California State Department of Education, 75% of Black boys in California didn't meet the state's reading and writing standards. As early as fourth grade, 80% of Black boys failed to meet the state reading benchmarks. Blacks also have the lowest graduation rate in California at 73%, which is lower than the national average of roughly 80%. Data obtained from another report in 2018 demonstrate that despite significant progress, the national black graduation rate still trails Asian, white, and Hispanic counterparts. Now, data from a recent study done in Baltimore, Maryland, not only reported that close to 90% of black boys in the city of Baltimore can't read at grade level, but also 41% of all Baltimore City high school students, which are disproportionately black, earned below a 1.0 grade percent or 1.0 grade point average. The Forum on Child and Family Statistics shows that black students entering kindergarten for the first time score lower than their white counterparts in reading, math, science, cognitive flexibility, and other approaches to learning in basically every category tested. These gaps persisted throughout their entire schooling from 4th, 8th, and 12th grades. Now, the statistics demonstrate that upon graduation, the average black high school graduate is the academic equivalent to the average white 8th grade graduate. Subsequently, black students are less likely than our counterparts to enroll in advanced placement courses. Black students represent 14% of all AP students, but only 4% of those scoring at least a 3 on the exam, which is the minimum score required to receive college credit. Only 20% of black students met the College Board's 2 standards, math and reading, for college readiness, compared to 59% of whites and 70% of Asians. So it doesn't get better when blacks get to college because, according to Inside Higher Ed, under 40% of blacks earn 4-year college degrees within 6 years, as opposed to 46% of Hispanics and 62% of whites, and 63% of Asians who receive their degrees in the same time period. And the reason is because, as a result of our lack of academic preparation, black students are required to take remedial courses that don't necessarily get college credit or don't count towards the units needed to graduate from college. So we have to spend more time in college taking remedial courses to get us up to where we should have been had we had legitimate primary and secondary education to prepare us for success. The status quo of allowing the intergenerational resignation of black school children to educational penitentiaries for 12-year sentences isn't working and should be unacceptable to black families. No amount of support for racial preference programs can magically compensate for or overcome a dozen years of academic inadequacy and discrepancy and underdevelopment once blacks reach college. Now, a report conducted from Georgetown University, African Americans, college majors, and earnings found that blacks are disproportionately concentrated in lower paying majors. Rather than increasing our representation in STEM fields, blacks are more likely to choose majors like early childhood education, ethnic studies, social work, religion, or public administration. Now, to be clear, I'm not knocking those particular majors. My undergraduate degree was in humanities and religious studies. I got a master's in theology and a doctorate in theology and ministry. But freely picking these subjects with lower earning potential is much, much different than submitting to these majors as a consolation resulting from the lack of scholastic preparation and development. After years of low expectations and undereducation, a little to no preparation to excel, this is the predictable result. Now, these challenges are significant, and they don't take into consideration the racialized demand to reduce school discipline, suspension, and expulsion of disruptive students because of the disproportionate outcomes of behavioral policy. Besides higher expectations, discipline is what many of our children need. Now, despite these challenges, a poll conducted for the American Federation for Children showed that 72% of black parents supported school choice. Now, black families have effectively protested past injustices, yet we are silent regarding the coordinated system of inadequate education our children are confined to, which leads to insufficient preparation for later life. Until we as black families start to speak the language of education and academic achievement and demand reform so loudly and defiantly that it's impossible to ignore, the status quo of maintaining black inferiority in education will continue. So will the discrepancy on the external interventionism of diversity and equity to fabricate a false sense of achievement and equality. Now, let me explain this academic part a little bit more about why the teachers unions prevent our children from getting a good education. We have been deliberately and purposely underserved by substandard government schooling for generations, as I said previously. This is mostly due to the considerable influence on the teachers' unions. Now, I did some digging, and according to the Center for Responsive Politics, for more than 20 years, at least 90% of political donations given to teachers' unions have gone to the Democrat Party. In the 2018 election, 96% of political contributions given by teachers' unions went to Democrats. Therefore, it's no surprise that the Democrat Party is perpetuating the educational status quo rather than reforming public education and giving us as black parents more power to choose the schools that we want our children to attend. Now, this includes charter schools. Former President Barack Obama lauded the benefits of public education while sending his daughters, Sasha and Malia, to Sidwell Friends, a private Quaker school that at the time cost close to $40,000 per year per student. Now, to be clear, I'm not necessarily knocking or condemning Barack Obama for enjoying the freedom to choose how and where his daughters were educated, or other elected officials for deciding who educates their children and where. But I am condemning the immorality of exercising and flaunting these freedoms that are deliberately not extended to most parents who want the same ability to ensure their children receive the best possible academic preparation possible. My parents did the same thing. We didn't have a lot of money. My mother worked for the state. My dad worked for a local gas company. They both were raised under Jim Crow in Mississippi and Texas. When they came out here, it was time for us to go to school. They kind of went to the schools and said, listen, we know what it's like to not have resources. We know what it's like not to be taken seriously as school children. We don't want the same for our children. So they made the sacrifices to put me in schools that were going to challenge me so that I could exceed. And they told me, no matter what you do in education, you have to try and do more to prove that you are just as good as your white counterparts, because they're going to look at you and simply based off of your skin think that you possess the inability to be proficient. So I had to try twice as hard, and I didn't like it because it meant more work. You don't understand those things when you're younger. As I got older and I started teaching in public schools and giving lectures to college students across the country, I realized what a benefit that was on the back end. And I think that more parents, given the ability to choose whether they want to pay for their children's education or put them in a higher performing public school, should be given that opportunity. The rationale, the moral rationale to prevent people doesn't fly. And I think that we need to call people out on that. Now, in addition to, and real quickly, I point out the Democrat Party and their being controlled by the teachers union. I'm not making the case that blacks should wholesale leave the Democrat Party and vote for Republicans, because Republicans haven't done much to earn our vote. But what I am saying is collectively declaring our political independence from both parties. That way both parties have to work for our votes. And one of the ways they can do that is by improving education. And that would, in my opinion, would demonstrate what political party took our concerns seriously. As a side, Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, won the governorship in 2020, I believe, 2018. I can't remember when he was elected, primarily on the strength of black women in the state of Florida. I think it was like 100,000 black women came out and voted for Ron DeSantis because he promised them the ability to choose what schools their children were going to go to and who educated their children. That was enough to put him over the edge, and he was running against a black candidate. Ron DeSantis is a Republican. Again, I'm not saying that you have to change your political affiliation, but what I am saying is he took those concerns seriously and was rewarded. And I think that, to me, is a microcosm of what could happen nationally if we are loud enough for them to not ignore us. The refusal of black families to fight diligently for better academic and economic opportunities for ourselves and our communities subscribes many of us to lives of indignity, while strategically faulting that life and humiliation on the continuance of racial victimization. In a perverse sense, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy that not only proves the invisible but manipulating hand of white supremacy and white privilege and racial discrimination, but reinforces an identity based on oppression. Now, having said that, we also must relearn the language of self-love. That begins by rebuilding our families. We need to prioritize the importance and virtue of marriage prior to having children. We need to reinforce the idea that being a good father motivates a man to demonstrate a responsible masculinity for his son and to be the standard of a future husband for his daughter. One of the obvious and inarguable reasons for the black cultural chaos is the disintegration of black families. Now, according to the National Center of Health Statistics, 69% of black births were illegitimate compared to 28% for whites. The national non-immigrant illegitimate birth is at 40%. So overall, children born outside of wedlock for the country as a whole is 40%. Now, data collected by the U.S. Census Bureau show that 64% of children living or under the age of 18 live in single-parent households. Over 80% of those are single-parent households headed by women. Now, during a Father's Day address at the Apostolic Church of God in Chicago, Senator Barack Obama, while he was campaigning for president, acknowledged much when he said children who grow up without a father are 5 times more likely to live in poverty and commit crime, 9 times more likely to drop out of schools, and 20 times more likely to end up in prison. They are more likely to have behavioral problems or run away from home or become teenage parents themselves. And the foundations of our community are weaker because of it. Now, additionally, this is worth noting. Illegitimacy in fatherless homes aren't the result of the legacy of slavery or the result of the continued discrimination against blacks. I know that's largely said, but that's actually not true. Herbert Gutman wrote a book called The Black Family and Slavery and Freedom between 1750 and 1925. His research shows that during this period, more than 80% of black children under 6 lived with both parents. Additionally, as late as 1920, a teenage girl raising a child without a man present was rare among blacks. Black illegitimacy was 19% in 1940. In the 1950s, it was roughly 18% of single-parent homes were headed by black women. Even the commonly cited Moynihan Report, technically known as the Negro Family, the Case for National Action, written by Assistant Secretary of Labor Daniel Patrick Moynihan, showed that black illegitimacy in 1964 was 24%, and black female-headed households was 25%. Both were much higher during that time than during the period immediately following the cessation of slavery, which undercuts the commonly held view, including by Moynihan himself, that slavery was the genesis of black family disintegration. In 2017, the black marriage rate was around 30%, whereas the national average is close to 50%. Black women are the least married demographic. 37% have never been married. 64% of black women between the ages of 19 and 44 have chosen cohabitation to marriage, which, though marginally better than being a single parent, still doesn't provide the stability that accompanies marriage. Some of the additional consequences of fatherlessness are fatherless families are 44% more likely to raise children living in poverty, according to the U.S. Census. 90% of all homeless and runaway children are fatherless. Children from fatherless homes are 10 times more likely to abuse chemical substances. 71% of all substance abusers come from fatherless homes. Children from fatherless homes are 2 times more likely to commit suicide. 70% of adolescents in correctional facilities are from fatherless homes. 60% of rapists come from fatherless homes. Children who are fatherless are 20 times more likely to be incarcerated, and 70% of teen pregnancies happen in fatherless homes. So marriage is not important just as a social covenant of mutual responsibility and a stable environment in which to raise children, but marriage goes a long way in reducing poverty. Stable families with married parents are the most successful anti-poverty programs in existence. The poverty rate for black married couples has been under 10% since 1994, and right now it's at 6.4%. The poverty rate for black female-headed households is 32% currently. Before the COVID-induced panic and subsequent economic shutdown, the overall black poverty rate was 21%. So when the topic of racial wealth discrepancies is discussed, most neglect to include that a contributing factor to this economic incongruity, aside from free will decision-making, is that whites marry in higher rates than blacks. 2 parents are better than 1, and dual incomes are better than 1. And they're generally much higher. So if one is serious about reducing economic disparities, one must advocate that black people get and preferably stay married. Now, the disintegration of black families is a very serious problem, which has led to what many people refer to as black genocide. As a result of black family breakdown, blacks accounted for 60 or 36% of all abortions between 2007 and 2010. In 2014, the national abortion rate among blacks remained unchanged at 36%. In 2016, however, the Centers for Disease Control reported that non-Hispanic black women accounted for 38% of all abortions, while non-Hispanic white women accounted for 35%. In 2012, 60% of black pregnancies in New York City ended in abortion. Now, I have to say that again because that's such a striking statistic that I don't think a lot of people take that into consideration. In 2012, 60% of black pregnancies in New York City ended in abortion. In Mississippi, between 1995 and 2010, 72% of black pregnancies ended in abortion. In 2016, 80% of black pregnancies in Mississippi ended in abortion. The sad reality is that abortions are responsible for roughly 900 deaths of preborn black babies per day. And according to a report published in the Open Journal of Preventative Medicine, induced abortion is the leading cause of death amongst American blacks at 61%. The leading cause. These statistics are not only the result of a lack of self-love or self-worth, it's also because Planned Parenthood puts 80% of its surgical centers in neighborhoods that are disproportionately black and Latino. It is very hard to scream that Black Lives Matter when black women are killing our preborn children at such high rates. Black children lucky enough to escape the womb unharmed have a very high likelihood of being killed by another black who is also lucky enough to be born. They have the disproportionate probability of engaging in delinquency and experiencing the correctional system. According to the data collected between 1980 and 2008 by the Bureau of Justice Statistics, the homicide offender rate for blacks was almost 25%, which was 7 times higher than the offending rate of whites. The homicide victimization rate for blacks was roughly 6 times higher than the victimization rates for whites. Blacks were also 47% of all homicide victims and 53% of all homicide offenders. During the same period, we accounted for 62% of all drug-related homicides compared to 37% committed by whites. Over 65% of all drug-related homicide offenders were blacks. Whites comprised 33%. According to the same report, blacks were 44% of felony murder victims and almost 60% of felony murder offenders. Blacks were also disproportionately represented in gun homicide rates, accounting for 51% of all victims and 57% of offenders. Black offenders committed 93% of all black homicides. The FEI statistics were no better. In 2012, out of the almost 2,700 black victims of homicides, blacks were responsible for over 2,400. Of the over 14,000 total murder offenders, 38% were black. These and other statistics stand as evidence against so-called mass incarceration. And I say that because, well, I'll come back to that. Strictly speaking, more blacks are disproportionately in jail and prison because, as the data show, unfortunately, blacks commit a disproportionate amount of crime relative to our numbers in the general population. In today's cultural climate, observing data and accurately reporting it, especially when it casts us in a bad light, is considered taboo. But if we want to solve the problem, we must speak honestly about it. Data and common sense show that stable families reduce criminal activity. Now, a lot of times when I discuss this in churches and in church-based organizations, a lot of people will say, well, what about the Black Lives Matter movement and the numbers of cops that are killing unarmed blacks? I'm only going to give you the statistics for the past couple of years, but I have several years in front of me, and I'm willing to email Apostle Quick and give all of this to make it accessible to everybody. But in 2019, according to the Washington Post, and the Washington Post has been keeping a database of the number of people overall that have been shot by law enforcement officers, I think since 2014. But in 2019, 999 people were shot and killed by police. 250 of those were black, 403 were white. Of the 250 blacks that were shot and killed by police, 14 were unarmed. Now, of those 14 victims, police shot 8 because they resisted arrest and fled. So out of that number, only 5 unarmed blacks were shot and killed by police, if we take into consideration those who didn't flee or try to attack the officer. In 2020, 1,021 people were shot by police. 244 of them were black, 459 were white. Of the 244 blacks that were shot, roughly 18 were unarmed. Of those 18, 10 were confirmed as attempting to flee officers, which means police shot 8 unarmed blacks that year. In other words, despite a small uptick in 2020, the number of unarmed blacks that were shot and killed by police who weren't trying to evade arrest significantly declined year over year. And this is going back to 2016, 2017. Now, these statistics directly refute the deliberate dishonesty that says that blacks are targets of out of control, systemically racist law enforcement officers. I'm not saying that all law enforcement officers are perfect. Just like everything and everyone else on this side of heaven, we are all deeply, deeply flawed people. But I think that we have to speak honestly about the problem and say, okay, we can all agree that the phrase Black Lives Matter exists, but we have to be honest about what's going on in this particular avenue to say, okay, well, it's not as big of an issue as they're making it out to be. As a matter of fact, some of the things that I said prior to that and what I will say going forward are much more important to improving the quality of life of blacks than narrowly focusing on the number of unarmed blacks that are shot by police. I'm not justifying it. I'm simply saying we have to prioritize it in the level order of importance. I won't speak too much about mass incarceration. I just raised it, but time doesn't permit me to do that. But I do want to say a few things. The terms new Jim Crow and mass incarceration, I think, are deeply fraudulent terms. The discrimination that blacks faced during Jim Crow were okay, let me say that. The blacks that faced discrimination in Jim Crow were in essence innocent. Their crime, if one wants to use that term, resulted from being born black and the social stereotypes that were created and perpetuated about blacks. When we take the terminology of Jim Crow in reference to the high rate of blacks in penitentiaries, those who use the term insinuate that those blacks too are only imprisoned because they're black without regard to the actions that justify imprisonment. To do this trivializes what blacks endured in Jim Crow because they were innocent. It minimizes the crimes committed by black prisoners, but it also belittles the victims of those crimes. Now remember, most crime is intraracial, means it happens internally. So the majority of the crime that happens to blacks is perpetuated by blacks. The majority of crimes that happens to whites happens by whites. So when we call this mass incarceration the new Jim Crow, we are actually trivializing and belittling the victims of violent crimes. And I think that's an immoral position to take. I think it undermines any type of credibility one brings to the argument who wants to seriously discuss how we minimize the numbers of blacks in jails and in penitentiaries across the country. Having said that, we should discuss the high rates of blacks incarcerated, but we have to do it fairly honestly. We can't start in the middle of the story. We also have to start at the very beginning. And as I said before, at the very beginning, the reason why so many blacks are in penitentiaries across the country is because they come from fatherless homes. So we should start advocating intact families on the front end to reduce the numbers of blacks in prisons and jails, but also talk about how do we reduce sentencing for truly nonviolent criminals, not ones that have pled down to less violent crimes that had committed violent crimes, but truly nonviolent criminals. I think we can do two things at once and still have the moral authority and credibility to be taken seriously. Now, regarding the language of self-love, loving ourselves obligate us to revive the stigma that once accompanied self-degrading behavior. Black families can recover a sense of self-pride that unequivocally condemns self-destructive violence and excessive criminality that dishonors us and our communities. Proverbs 22:6 says, "Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he's old, he shall not depart from it." Blacks also need to end the selective moral outrage that prioritizes blacks killed by law enforcement officers above those blacks that are killed by other blacks, be them in the womb, in the streets, or innocent victims in their homes. Black families must demonstrate that we care for ourselves by investing in ourselves, just like our multi-ethnic counterparts do amongst them. We can't convince others that Black lives matter until we convincingly prove to ourselves that Black lives matter. In other words, we can't convince others to love us and take us seriously if we don't love ourselves and take ourselves seriously first. To waste the freedom and opportunity that our Black predecessors fought and died for is morally inexcusable. Most of all, Black families must relearn the language of Christian morality and faith. Blacks appear to have discarded the conventional language of the Christian gospel, and the effects are undeniably noticeable to all. And I say this because every poll that has been taken over the last 10 years, 15 years that I've been following it, demonstrates that blacks are the most religious demographic in the country. We are more likely to believe that the Bible is the Word of God. We are more likely to read our Bible on a daily basis. We are more likely to attend church services and Bible study during the week. We are more likely to pray to God. We are more likely to believe that God listens to our prayers and intercedes on our behalf. So, by every discernible metric that one would qualify as religious, blacks are the most religious demographic. So, I raise this issue because we have a very rich legacy. As I said earlier in my remarks, that spiritual legacy sustained us through slavery, and it was literally the moral foundation that forced the country to live up to its ideals and its creeds. There's something there, and I think that it would benefit us all to return to that. In some respects, too many blacks have embraced an oppositional mentality and act as if they embrace what I said earlier about having lower standards for ourselves when compared to other people. We've also acquiesced ourselves to this imprudence, and it has revealed itself in a number of socioeconomic challenges. It's also displayed in the disrespect shown to authority, the contempt blacks have for ourselves and our families, the production consumption of sexually explicit images, the indifference shown to the values that are predictors of success in favor of the crutch-like dependence on guilt-ridden racial shakedowns leveraged against apprehensive whites to assert a perverted notion of collectivized racial power. Any power that leverages or is based on guilt, it is not power, it's manipulation. Much of our self-destruction happens and we don't blink an eye. We used to speak the language of Christian faith and morality extremely well, but the legacy is increasingly difficult to distinguish today. It has nourished us, and it has been such a central part of our lives that to turn our back on it now it's almost unforgivable. We need not do that. I think that the Bible and Christian tradition is a reservoir of wisdom, of practical guidance and advice on how to live our lives that demonstrates our relationship to the Creator as well as the love of our neighbor. So our horizontal relationship with our neighbor is proof and evidence of our or vertical relationship with God. And I think that we need to return to that. There's a certain strength in Christian morality and faith, and we need it again. It is demonstrated in loving ourselves and our neighbor and embracing the Christian concept of forgiveness as a concept of power through humility. This facilitates reconciliation and the fortification of the familial bond in Jesus Christ. It is the strength to recognize that to be fully alive in and with Jesus Christ, redeemed as fellow heirs to the coming kingdom, requires the death of the former self of the flesh and our racialized identity that has been so too long dependent on black racialization and a victim focused mentality. It means that we have to die to the flesh and be alive in the Holy Spirit. If we are a Christian, we are a new creation. A life lived according to the flesh is dead. The life lived according to the Spirit is very much alive. This means acknowledging the past cannot be changed, but also having the optimistic understanding that the past does not determine our future. Now, all of these issues I think that I've talked about today are important, but I think the last one is the most important. I think it is central to rejecting a culture based in cancellation. Again, just like black development and outcome based equity are at odds, cancel culture or this manipulation of power leveraged against guilt is incompatible with forgiveness. we are taught to forgive, and I think it's instrumental that one of Jesus' parables, he says, if you are in front of the altar and you are giving your gift to God, and you realize that you are you're in an improper relationship with your brother, you're at odds with your brother, leave your gift at the altar and first be reconciled to your brother. And to me, that communicates something. And I think it's instructive for our situation, our historical situation. One of the most religious things that a Jew in the first century could do was give offering to God. And what Jesus is saying in this parable is that even though this is the most important thing in your life, is showing your religious devotion to your God, one way to show a greater religious devotion is to be reconciled to your neighbor. He's given us the ministry of reconciliation. So it's to leave that gift at the altar, which means he's prioritizing reconciliation with our brother versus our offering to God. And so I think that's something that we need to go back to. And the idea of forgiving our brother, again, doesn't mean ignoring or forgetting what has happened to us in the past. It just simply says that we can't use what has happened in the past to dictate our future, particularly with our multi-ethnic brothers and sisters in the family of Jesus Christ. We have to forgive. And I think that we have the power to forgive. It doesn't erase what happened. It doesn't minimize what happens. It is simply to say that it is power through humility. It doesn't define us anymore. And I think that to me, I've argued elsewhere, the ability to forgive and not to hold grudges, particularly against us. And again, there's a lot of people who are still alive that were living in Jim Crow segregation and can speak very clearly about what they endured under Jim Crow segregation. But being able to forgive is almost a reformulation of Black power, not the secularized version that came after the civil rights, but a religious, spiritual Black power that shows that this demonstrates, as it has so many times in our nation's history, the power of Black faith, the power of Black religion, the power of Black theology before its radicalization. And I say Black only because if not for the white church segregating us and not accepting us, there would be no Black church. But because the Black church was made, there's a significant theological and religious tradition in the pursuit of justice that incorporates forgiveness and love, that I think that churches, broadly speaking, in the American context, are missing out on by not going to Black churches and understanding this type of applied Black religion and Black theology. So I've pretty much exhausted my time, but I just want to say again, we have the ability to correct the things that are compromising our communities. That isn't to say that racial discrimination doesn't exist, but it isn't a totalizing excuse that explains all of the discrepancies and disparities in our lives as it used to do. But again, our development has to take priority over outcome-based equity or equality. We can no longer depend on other peoples to do for us what we are capable of doing for ourselves. That type of interventionism, whether it's government or other people, reinforces to the outside world that we are helpless apart from that type of intercession. I don't believe that. I don't think most Blacks believe that. And if my anecdotal experiences in churches across the country are any indicator, most Blacks don't want that. We just have not spoken up loudly to say, yes, work with us in continued pursuit of justice and equality, but don't intercede for us. We are not children. We're capable of doing these things on our own. And again, history has demonstrated that we have done it in an America that was much more racist.